The private jet terminal at Miami International Airport buzzed with its usual quiet efficiency on that sweltering summer afternoon. Among the handful of travelers stood Mrs. Richardson, a self-made tech entrepreneur worth billions, though you wouldn't know it from her understated appearance. She wore a simple navy blazer over dark slacks, her natural hair pulled back in a neat bun, carrying just a sleek leather briefcase and small carry-on. As the owner of one of the fastest-growing software companies in the country, Mrs. Richardson had learned to move through the world with quiet confidence. Today's flight was routine, a quick trip to Silicon Valley for an important board meeting. She'd made this journey countless times before, yet something felt different from the moment she approached the check-in counter. The airline representative barely glanced up from her computer screen when Mrs. Richardson presented her first-class boarding pass. "Economy boarding is at the other terminal," the agent said dismissively, continuing to type. "I'm in first class," Mrs. Richardson replied calmly, sliding her ID and boarding pass forward. The agent's eyes flickered between the documents and Mrs. Richardson's face, her expression shifting from dismissal to forced politeness. "Oh, I apologize, Mrs. Richardson. Yes, I see it here." The words came out strained, as if they cost her something to say. Mrs. Richardson was used to these moments, the subtle doubts, the quick assumptions. After 20 years building her tech empire, they rolled off her back like water. But what happened next was different. As she made her way through the premium security lane, Mrs. Richardson overheard two flight attendants talking near the coffee station, unaware she could hear them clearly. "Can you believe they let these people buy first-class tickets now?" one whispered to the other. "It's not like they know how to behave up there. Watch, she'll probably ask for Kool-Aid instead of champagne." The other attendant snickered, adding, "Well, at least she's not in sweats. Remember that one last week? Acting like she owned the place." Mrs. Richardson's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her briefcase handle, but her expression remained neutral. Years of boardroom negotiations had taught her the power of appearing unbothered. Instead of confronting them, she made mental notes of their name tags, their features, the time, and their exact words. The flight attendants' attitudes followed her onto the plane like an unwelcome shadow. As she settled into her first-class seat, 2A, she noticed the same attendants' expressions sour when they realized she was in their section. The next hour became a masterclass in passive-aggressive service. When other passengers received warm greetings and immediate attention, Mrs. Richardson's requests were met with delayed responses and barely concealed disdain. Her request for a glass of water went mysteriously unheard. When she pressed the call button to remind them, one attendant rolled her eyes before approaching. "Yes," the attendant asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "What can I help you with?" "I asked for water 15 minutes ago," Mrs. Richardson stated quietly. "Oh, did you? I must have missed it. We've been so busy with our regular passengers." The emphasis on regular wasn't lost on Mrs. Richardson. As she sat there, sipping the eventually delivered lukewarm water, her mind wasn't on revenge, it was on responsibility. She thought about her teenage daughter, about all the young black women in tech she mentored, about the changes she could make to ensure they wouldn't face these same battles. What the flight crew didn't know was that Mrs. Richardson sat on the board of several major airlines' investment groups. She had built her fortune not just through tech innovation, but through strategic investments and partnerships across industries. Her company's software powered the booking systems of 3 major carriers. As the flight progressed, she pulled out her laptop and began typing. Not a complaint email, those rarely led to real change, but rather a detailed business analysis. She researched the airline's diversity training programs, their hiring practices, their customer service metrics across different demographics. The more she dug, the clearer the picture became. She noted how the same flight attendants who had dismissed her were perfectly capable of professional behavior when they thought it mattered. They fawned over a white tech CEO 3 rows back, whom Mrs. Richardson recognized from several industry conferences. The contrast was stark and telling. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Mrs. Richardson had already drafted the outline of a comprehensive corporate culture overhaul. Her revenge wouldn't be petty or personal, it would be systematic and transformative. She would use this experience as leverage to implement real change, not just for herself but for every passenger who'd ever been judged by their appearance rather than their ticket. The flight attendants continued their subtle slights throughout the journey, unaware that their actions were catalyzing a major shift in their industry's future. When one of them accidentally spilled coffee near Mrs. Richardson's designer shoes, she simply dabbed at the spots with a napkin, her mind already mapping out the implementation of new training protocols and accountability measures. As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, Mrs. Richardson finished the first draft of her proposal. It wasn't just about punishing bad behavior, it was about creating systemic change. She would use her position and influence to ensure that future travelers wouldn't have to maintain their dignity in the face of such treatment. The same flight attendants who had whispered and snickered earlier now wore fixed smiles as passengers prepared to disembark. They had no idea that their casual cruelty had set in motion events that would reshape their entire industry's approach to service and inclusion. Mrs. Richardson was the last to leave first class, taking her time to gather her belongings. As she stood, she finally made direct eye contact with the flight attendants who had made her journey so uncomfortable. Her gaze wasn't angry or triumphant, it was calm, knowing, and perhaps a touch sympathetic. After all, they had no idea what was coming. The next morning, in her suite at the Four Seasons Silicon Valley, Mrs. Richardson began her day earlier than usual. The events from yesterday's flight hadn't left her mind, but they had crystallized into something more powerful than anger, pure determination. As she sipped her morning tea, she opened her laptop and began making calls. Her first call was to Dr. Chen, her company's head of human resources and a leading expert in corporate culture transformation. "I need you to clear your schedule for the next few weeks," she said, her voice steady and purposeful. "We're about to take on something bigger than tech." As she explained the situation, Dr. Chen's interest grew audibly. "This isn't just about one bad experience," Mrs. Richardson explained. "It's about changing the entire culture of an industry that's been resistant to change for decades." Her next call was to her old friend and fellow board member at the airline's parent company. "I need an emergency board meeting," she stated. "And I need access to all customer service complaints from the past 5 years, categorized by demographic data." The numbers that came back were staggering. Complaints about discriminatory treatment weren't just occasional incidents, they formed a pattern that stretched across years and multiple airlines. Mrs. Richardson's experience wasn't an anomaly, it was a symptom of a systemic problem that had been ignored for too long. By midday, her hotel room had transformed into a command center. Her assistant had arranged for a team of diversity consultants to fly in, and her legal team was already drafting proposals for new industry-wide standards. The airline's board members, sensing the gravity of the situation, agreed to an emergency meeting the following week. But Mrs. Richardson wasn't just working on the corporate level. She reached out to several influential travel bloggers and social media personalities who had shared similar experiences. Not to shame the airline, but to gather data and build a coalition for change. One travel influencer, a popular content creator with millions of followers, shared how she documented similar treatment across multiple airlines. "But nobody ever does anything about it," she told Mrs. Richardson during their video call. "They just offer air miles and hope will go away." "Not this time," Mrs. Richardson replied, her voice firm. "This time, we're changing the game entirely." She spent the afternoon in her scheduled board meetings, appearing perfectly composed despite running her parallel mission. During breaks, she reviewed the preliminary findings from her team. The data painted a clear picture: discriminatory treatment wasn't just hurting passengers, it was hurting the airline's bottom line. Customer retention rates among minority passengers were significantly lower than average. Negative social media mentions related to discriminatory treatment had increased by 300% over the past 3 years. The airlines were losing millions in potential revenue, all because they hadn't addressed their culture problem. That evening, as she prepared for dinner with potential investors, Mrs. Richardson received an unexpected email. It was from a former flight attendant who had worked for the airline for 15 years. The email detailed a culture of unchecked biases and informal practices that had become normalized over time. "We were never explicitly told to treat people differently," the former attendant wrote, "but there was an unspoken understanding about who belonged in first class and who didn't. Anyone who challenged these assumptions was often socially ostracized by their colleagues." Mrs. Richardson forwarded the email to her team with a note, "This is exactly what we need to change. Not just the actions, but the underlying culture that enables them." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings and strategy sessions. Mrs. Richardson's team developed a comprehensive proposal that included a complete overhaul of flight crew training programs, focusing on unconscious bias and cultural competency. Anonymous reporting systems for passengers and crew members to report discriminatory incidents. Regular third-party audits of customer service interactions across different demographic groups. Financial incentives tied to inclusive service metrics. Partnerships with diversity consulting firms to provide ongoing training and support. But Mrs. Richardson knew that policy changes alone weren't enough. The real challenge would be changing hearts and minds. She arranged for several focus groups with flight crews, including some who had expressed resistance to previous diversity initiatives. During these sessions, she listened more than she spoke. She heard their fears about change, their defensive reactions to accusations of bias, and their own experiences with difficult passengers. Instead of dismissing their concerns, she incorporated them into her strategy. "We're not here to point fingers or assign blame," she told her team. "We're here to create a better experience for everyone, passengers and crew members alike." By the end of the week, Mrs. Richardson had built a coalition of supporters within the industry. Several other airlines, sensing the shifting winds, reached out to express interest in her initiative. What had started as a response to personal mistreatment was evolving into an industry-wide movement. The flight attendants from her original flight had no idea that their actions had sparked such a massive response. They were still working their regular routes, probably treating other passengers with the same casual disdain they had shown her. But their days of unchecked behavior were numbered. As Mrs. Richardson prepared to fly back home, she couldn't help but smile at the irony. Those flight attendants had assumed she didn't belong in first class, never knowing that she was about to reshape their entire professional world. Their attempt to make her feel small had only revealed how much power she actually held, not just through her wealth, but through her ability to transform systems from within. She booked her return flight on the same airline, requesting the same route and crew. Not out of spite, but because she wanted to observe their behavior one more time before the changes began. This time, she would be watching not as a victim of their prejudice, but as an architect of their future. The morning of the emergency board meeting arrived with a weight of anticipation. Mrs. Richardson stood before her hotel mirror, adjusting her tailored charcoal suit. Today wasn't about revenge, it was about revolution in an industry that desperately needed it. As her car pulled up to the airline's corporate headquarters, she noticed a small group of people gathered near the entrance. They were current and former flight attendants, some holding signs demanding better training and support. Word of her initiative had spread through industry circles, inspiring others to speak up. Mrs. Richardson called out one of the flight attendants, a woman with 20 years of experience. "We've been trying to get management to listen to us for years. They keep saying there isn't a problem." She stopped to speak with them, listening to their stories. One flight attendant tearfully described how she'd been pressured to profile passengers based on appearance. Another shared how reporting discriminatory behavior had led to her being ostracized by colleagues. "Change is coming," Mrs. Richardson assured them, making mental notes to incorporate their experiences into her presentation. Inside the boardroom, she faced a sea of skeptical faces. Most of the board members were older white men who had never experienced the kind of treatment she'd encountered. They saw her proposal as an unnecessary expense, a solution to a problem they didn't believe existed. The costs of implementing these changes would be substantial, one board member argued, frowning at the proposal before him. And frankly, Mrs. Richardson, while your experience was unfortunate, it seems like an isolated incident. Mrs. Richardson smiled slightly, having anticipated this response. She picked up her remote and began her presentation. Let me show you exactly how isolated this incident isn't. The screen behind her filled with data, thousands of complaints, categorized and analyzed. Customer satisfaction scores broken down by demographic groups. Revenue losses from decreased customer loyalty. Social media sentiment analysis showing growing public frustration. These aren't just numbers, she explained, her voice steady and authoritative. Each data point represents a passenger who experienced discrimination on your airlines. Many never complained formally, they simply took their business elsewhere. She clicked to the next slide, revealing financial projections. Your current approach isn't just morally wrong, it's hurting your bottom line. Studies show that companies with strong diversity and inclusion practices outperform their competitors by 35%. The room grew quieter as she continued, laying out not just problems but detailed solutions. Her proposal included partnerships with leading diversity training firms, updated service protocols, and a revolutionary customer feedback system that would track and address discriminatory incidents in real time. But the most compelling evidence, she said, pulling up a final slide, comes from your own employees. The screen filled with anonymous testimonials from flight crews across the airline. Stories of witnessed discrimination, of wanting to speak up but fearing retaliation, of feeling trapped in a culture that normalized bias. One board member, who had been silently taking notes, finally spoke up. Mrs. Richardson, these changes you're proposing, they're not just about customer service, are they? This is about transforming our entire corporate culture. Exactly, she replied. And that's why it will work. Surface-level changes won't solve systemic problems. We need to rebuild from the ground up. As the meeting progressed, she could see the resistance beginning to crack. The data was undeniable, the solutions practical, and the potential benefits clear. Even the most skeptical board members couldn't argue with the financial projections. During the lunch break, Mrs. Richardson received an unexpected text from one of the flight attendants who had treated her so poorly. Word of the meeting had spread through the airline's internal channels, and the flight crew was beginning to realize who she really was. I want to apologize, the message read. I never thought about how my actions affected people. I just followed what everyone else did. I know it's not enough, but I want to be part of the change. Mrs. Richardson showed the message to Dr. Chen, who had joined her for the meeting. See? This is exactly what we're aiming for, not punishment, but transformation. The afternoon session focused on implementation details. Mrs. Richardson's team had prepared comprehensive timelines, budget allocations, and success metrics. They had thought of everything, from updating training materials to revising hiring practices. This isn't just about avoiding bad publicity, she explained to the board. It's about building a better airline. Imagine being known as the industry leader in inclusive service. Imagine your crews being proud to work here, your passengers feeling truly valued. As the sun began to set outside the boardroom windows, the board called for a vote. The tension in the room was palpable. Mrs. Richardson maintained her composed exterior, but her heart raced as the votes were counted. The proposal passed, not unanimously, but with a solid majority. The dissenters looked unhappy but resigned, the evidence and potential benefits were too strong to ignore. As she packed up her materials after the meeting, the board chairman approached her. You know, "Mrs. Richardson, when I first heard about this emergency meeting, I thought you were just another angry customer looking for compensation. I've never been happier to be wrong." She smiled, thinking of all the passengers who would never have to experience what she did. Sometimes it takes someone who's been on both sides of the equation to see the full picture. That evening, as she prepared for her flight home, Mrs. Richardson received another message. The flight attendants' union wanted to meet with her to discuss how they could support the implementation of her proposals. The revolution she'd started was already taking on a life of its own. 3 weeks after the board meeting, Mrs. Richardson sat in her home office, reviewing the first wave of changes being implemented across the airline. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with updates, some encouraging, others concerning. Change, she knew, never came without resistance. The morning news played on her tablet, showing a viral video of another discriminatory incident on a different airline. Comments flooded social media, with many pointing to her initiative as an example of what the industry should be doing. Her inbox was filled with messages from executives at other airlines, some seeking guidance, others trying to get ahead of similar problems at their companies. "They're calling it the Richardson Revolution," her PR director informed her during their morning video call. The story's gaining traction, especially after that flight attendant's interview went viral. The interview in question had been unexpected. One of the flight attendants who had treated her so poorly had gone public with her story, not to defend herself, but to acknowledge her biases and discuss the importance of change. The video had racked up millions of views, sparking intense discussions about privilege and prejudice in the service industry. "I never saw myself as prejudiced," the flight attendant had said in the interview, her voice trembling. "But when Mrs. Richardson showed us those patterns in our behavior, I couldn't deny it anymore. We'd been treating people differently without even realizing it." The airline's training program was already undergoing its transformation. Mrs. Richardson had personally selected a diverse team of experts to redesign the curriculum. The first pilot group of flight attendants had just completed the new training, and their feedback was overwhelmingly positive. "It's like someone turned on a light," one crew member wrote in their evaluation. "I'm seeing my own behavior so differently now. Yesterday, I caught myself making assumptions about a passenger and stopped myself. That wouldn't have happened before." But not everyone embraced the changes. A small group of senior flight attendants had filed a complaint, claiming the new policies were reverse discrimination and created a hostile work environment. Mrs. Richardson had anticipated this reaction and was prepared. She organized a town hall meeting, inviting all employees to voice their concerns. The session was scheduled for today, and she intended to address the issues head-on. As she drove to the airline's training center, she reflected on how far they'd come in just a few weeks. The auditorium was packed when she arrived. Hundreds of airline employees filled the seats, their expressions ranging from supportive to skeptical. Mrs. Richardson took the stage, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. "I know some of you are uncomfortable with these changes," she began, her voice warm but firm. "Change is always uncomfortable. But discomfort can be a sign of growth." She shared stories from passengers who had faced discrimination, not to shame anyone but to build understanding. Then she invited employees to share their own experiences, both positive and negative. One senior flight attendant stood up, her voice shaking with emotion. "I've been flying for 30 years, and we've always done things a certain way. Now you're telling us everything we've been doing is wrong?" Mrs. Richardson smiled gently. "Not wrong, incomplete. We're not erasing your experience or expertise. We're expanding it. Think of it as adding new tools to your professional toolkit." The conversation shifted as more people shared their stories. A young flight attendant described how the new training had helped him handle a difficult situation with more empathy. A ground crew member admitted to previous biases he hadn't recognized. During the lunch break, Mrs. Richardson noticed the original flight attendants who had discriminated against her sitting together, looking thoughtful. She approached their table, causing them to freeze in surprise. "Would you mind if I join you?" she asked, sitting down with her lunch tray. The next 30 minutes became an honest conversation about fear, change, and growth. "We were afraid," one of them admitted. "Afraid of losing our jobs, afraid of being labeled as bad people. But this training, it's not about punishment. It's about becoming better at what we do." As the day progressed, Mrs. Richardson received word that 2 more major airlines had reached out, wanting to implement similar programs. What had started as a response to personal discrimination was becoming an industry-wide movement. The afternoon session focused on practical implementation. Mrs. Richardson's team demonstrated the new customer feedback system, which would allow real-time reporting and response to service issues. They introduced the mentorship program pairing experienced crew members with new hires from diverse backgrounds. "This isn't just about avoiding discrimination," Mrs. Richardson explained. "It's about excellence in service. When we treat every passenger with respect and dignity, everyone benefits, crew and customers alike." By day's end, even some of the strongest opponents had begun to see the value in the changes. The complaints about reverse discrimination were withdrawn, replaced by requests to be involved in shaping the new policies. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Richardson received an unexpected gift from the flight crew, a framed photo of the entire team with signatures and messages of support around the border. Among them was a note from one of the flight attendants who had initially treated her so poorly. "Thank you for seeing beyond our behavior to our potential. You had every right to demand our firing, but instead, you chose to invest in our growth. We won't let you down." On her drive home, Mrs. Richardson reflected on how different this outcome was from what people might have expected. They had anticipated a story of revenge, of a powerful woman using her influence to punish those who wronged her. Instead, it had become a story of transformation, of turning a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for widespread change. Her phone buzzed with a message from her daughter. "Mom, you're trending again. People are calling you the change maker. But I just call you my hero." Mrs. Richardson smiled, knowing that the real work was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, she could appreciate how far they'd come from that first confrontation on the plane. 6 months into the implementation of what the media had dubbed the Richardson Protocol, the airline industry was experiencing unprecedented changes. Mrs. Richardson stood at the podium of the International Aviation Conference in Dubai, preparing to deliver her keynote speech to a room full of airline executives, industry leaders, and flight crew representatives from around the world. The data displayed on the screen behind her told a compelling story. Customer satisfaction scores had risen by 40% across all demographics. Employee retention had improved significantly, and applications for flight crew positions had doubled, particularly among minority candidates. "When I boarded that flight 6 months ago," she began, her voice carrying across the hushed auditorium, "I never imagined it would lead to this moment. But sometimes, the most significant changes come from our most challenging experiences." In the front row sat the flight attendants from her original flight, not as examples of past mistakes, but as champions of change. They had become vocal advocates for the new training program, sharing their own journey of transformation with other airlines. During her speech, Mrs. Richardson revealed previously undisclosed data about the financial impact of inclusive service practices. The airline's revenue had increased by 23% in routes where the new protocols were fully implemented. Customer loyalty programs showed a 45% increase in retention among minority passengers. But the real success stories, she continued, aren't in these numbers. They're in the daily interactions that never make headlines. She shared a recent incident where a flight crew had prevented a potential discrimination situation before it occurred, turning what could have been another viral controversy into a moment of exemplary service. The crew's handling of the situation had become a case study in the new training program. After her speech, during the networking lunch, Mrs. Richardson found herself approached by an elderly airline executive from a major Asian carrier. "I've been in this industry for 40 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I always thought we were doing enough. You've shown us we were barely scratching the surface." But success had brought its own challenges. As Mrs. Richardson returned to her hotel room that evening, she reviewed reports of attempted copycat programs that missed the mark. Some airlines had tried to implement surface-level changes without addressing the underlying cultural issues. "They're missing the point," she explained during an emergency video call with her team. "This isn't about checking boxes or following a script. It's about fundamentally changing how we see and treat each other." The next morning brought news of another airline's failed attempt to implement similar changes. Their rushed approach had resulted in backlash from both passengers and crew members. Mrs. Richardson saw an opportunity rather than a setback. She reached out to the airline's management, offering to share resources and expertise. "We're not competitors in this," she told their CEO. "When one airline fails at inclusion, it affects trust in the entire industry." Back in her office at the conference center, Mrs. Richardson met with a group of flight attendants who had flown in from various airlines around the world. They shared stories of how the industry was changing, both the successes and the ongoing challenges. One flight attendant from a European airline described how the new awareness had helped her recognize her own internalized biases. "I thought I was one of the good ones," she admitted. "But watching your story made me examine my own behavior. I realized I had been part of the problem without knowing it." The conversation was interrupted by breaking news on the conference room's television. Another airline had just announced the adoption of the Richardson Protocol, becoming the 15th major carrier to do so. The industry was reaching a tipping point. Mrs. Richardson's phone lit up with a message from the original flight attendant who had discriminated against her. She had just been promoted to lead trainer in the new inclusion program. "Remember how I thought this would ruin my career?" her message read. "Instead, it gave me purpose. Thank you for seeing what we could become." That afternoon, Mrs. Richardson led a workshop on implementing sustainable change. She emphasized the importance of ongoing support and feedback rather than one-time training sessions. "Culture change isn't a destination," she explained. "It's a journey we must commit to every day." During the workshop, a young flight attendant shared a story that brought tears to many eyes. She described how the new protocols had given her the confidence to stand up against discrimination she witnessed, not just toward passengers but among crew members as well. "Last week, I heard a colleague make assumptions about a first-class passenger based on their appearance," she recounted. "Instead of staying silent, I used the techniques we learned to address it constructively. Not only did the situation get resolved, but my colleague actually thanked me afterward." As the conference drew to a close, Mrs. Richardson received an unexpected honor. The International Aviation Association announced the creation of the Richardson Award for Excellence in Inclusive Service, to be given annually to airlines that demonstrated exceptional progress in creating inclusive environments. In her hotel room that evening, Mrs. Richardson reflected on how far they'd come. She opened her laptop to find hundreds of messages from people around the world sharing their own experiences of discrimination and hope for change. One message particularly caught her attention. It was from a young black girl who had recently flown first class for the first time. "I was nervous about how I'd be treated," she wrote. "But the flight attendant made me feel like I belonged there. She told me about you and what you did to change things. When I grow up, I want to be like you, someone who turns bad experiences into positive change." Mrs. Richardson smiled, thinking about how a moment of discrimination had transformed into a movement for change. The airline industry would never be the same, and neither would the thousands of lives touched by these changes. But she knew their work wasn't finished. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth, and new chances to prove that sustainable change was possible. The Richardson Protocol wasn't just about airlines anymore, it was becoming a blueprint for how industries could transform themselves from within. 1 year after the incident that sparked an industry-wide revolution, Mrs. Richardson found herself in an unexpected position. Major corporations outside the airline industry had begun reaching out, eager to learn from what was now being called the Richardson method. She sat in her office, reviewing requests from hotel chains, cruise lines, and retail corporations, all seeking guidance on implementing similar changes. "We've created something bigger than we imagined," she told her leadership team during their morning meeting. The conference room wall displayed a map highlighting the global impact of their initiative. Pins marked locations where the protocol had been successfully implemented, creating a constellation of positive change across continents. But the morning's main discussion centered on a new challenge. A prominent business magazine had published an article questioning whether the changes were sustainable long-term. "Is the Richardson revolution just another corporate trend?" the headline asked, suggesting that some airlines were merely paying lip service to the principles without making genuine changes. "They're not entirely wrong," Mrs. Richardson admitted, surprising her team. "We're seeing some companies try to skip the hard work and jump straight to the results. That's not how real change happens." She pulled up recent data showing a concerning pattern. Some airlines had implemented surface-level changes, new uniforms, updated slogans, diversity posters, without addressing the deeper cultural issues. Their customer satisfaction scores showed initial improvement but began declining after a few months. "This is exactly what we need to address," she said, standing to write on the whiteboard. "We're not selling a product. We're creating a movement." That afternoon, Mrs. Richardson received an unexpected visitor. It was the daughter of one of the original flight attendants who had discriminated against her. The young woman, now in flight school herself, had come to share how her mother's transformation had affected their entire family. "Mom used to come home angry all the time," she explained, emotion clear in her voice. "She'd complain about passengers, about changes in the industry. But after going through your program, she changed. She started seeing people differently, treating them differently. It changed our home life too." This conversation sparked an idea. Mrs. Richardson realized they needed to document the ripple effects of their initiative, not just the professional changes, but the personal transformations happening in homes and communities. She launched a new project, Beyond the Cabin, collecting stories from airline employees about how the training had impacted their lives outside work. The responses were overwhelming. A ground crew member wrote about how the training helped him repair relationships with his neighbors, whom he had previously judged based on their cultural differences. A ticket agent shared how she now caught herself challenging her own assumptions about people in all aspects of her life. During a surprise visit to one of the airline's major hubs, Mrs. Richardson observed the changes firsthand. The atmosphere in the terminal was noticeably different. Crew members interacted with passengers more genuinely, taking time to ensure everyone felt valued and respected. She watched as a flight attendant handled a potentially tense situation with remarkable skill. A passenger had become agitated about a seating arrangement, making assumptions about another passenger's right to be in first class. Instead of escalating the situation, the flight attendant used the techniques from their training to diffuse the tension and create understanding between the passengers. Later that day, Mrs. Richardson met with a group of new hire flight attendants who had just completed their training. Their enthusiasm was palpable as they shared their experiences. "The best part," one new hire explained, "is that we're not just learning rules about what not to do. We're learning how to create positive experiences for everyone. It feels empowering." But the day also brought a reminder that their work wasn't finished. A video had gone viral showing discriminatory treatment on an airline that hadn't yet adopted the protocol. Social media was ablaze with comparisons between airlines that had implemented the changes and those that hadn't. Mrs. Richardson saw an opportunity in this crisis. She reached out to the airline's CEO, not to criticize, but to offer support. "Let's turn this moment into a catalyst for positive change," she proposed during their call. That evening, she received news that would take their initiative in an unexpected direction. A major university's business school wanted to create a case study about the Richardson method, teaching future business leaders about sustainable cultural transformation. Think about it, the dean explained during their video call. Your approach could influence how the next generation of leaders handles diversity and inclusion. This isn't just about airlines anymore. As she prepared for bed that night, Mrs. Richardson reviewed the latest feedback from the original airline where it all began. Employee satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. Turnover rates had plummeted. The airline had become an employer of choice, attracting top talent from diverse backgrounds. But what touched her most was a letter from a veteran flight attendant who had initially resisted the changes. "I've been flying for 30 years, he wrote, and I thought I knew everything about this job. Your program taught me that there's always room to grow, to become better, to see people more clearly. I'm not just a better flight attendant now, I'm a better person." The next morning brought a new challenge. A competing airline had announced their own inclusion program, claiming it would be faster and more efficient than the Richardson protocol. Mrs. Richardson smiled as she read the news. "They're missing the point," she told her team during their morning briefing. "Real change isn't about speed or efficiency. It's about commitment to genuine transformation. We're not in a race, we're on a journey." She spent the afternoon recording a series of training videos, sharing the philosophy behind the protocol. "The goal isn't to create perfect employees," she explained to the camera. "It's to create an environment where everyone, crew and passengers alike, can bring their full selves to the experience without fear of judgment or discrimination." As the day drew to a close, Mrs. Richardson received a photo from one of the original flight attendants. It showed a diverse group of crew members having dinner together, smiling genuinely. The caption read, "This wouldn't have happened a year ago. Thank you for showing us a better way." 18 months after the original incident, Mrs. Richardson found herself back at Miami International Airport, standing in the same terminal where it all began. The space felt different now, not just because of the new inclusive signage or the diverse staff, but because of the energy that filled the air. She was there to film a documentary about the transformation of the airline industry. A respected filmmaker had approached her, wanting to capture the story of how one moment of discrimination had sparked a global movement for change. As the camera crew set up their equipment, Mrs. Richardson watched the daily operations of the terminal. A flight crew walked past, their group naturally diverse, chatting and laughing together. At the check-in counter, an elderly passenger was being assisted with exceptional care by a young agent who, just a year ago, might have rushed through the interaction. "The changes are subtle but profound," she explained to the interviewer. "It's not just about what people do differently, it's about how they think differently." The documentary team had spent weeks interviewing airline employees across the country. They'd captured stories of transformation that even Mrs. Richardson hadn't heard before. A particularly moving segment featured a flight attendant who had worked in the industry for decades. "I used to think I was just doing my job," the attendant had said, tears in her eyes. "But looking back, I can see how many people I hurt without even realizing it. The Richardson protocol didn't just change how I work, it changed how I see the world." During a break in filming, Mrs. Richardson received an urgent call from her team. A major airline in Asia was facing backlash after a series of discriminatory incidents. Instead of implementing real changes, they had tried to solve the problem with a quick public relations campaign. "This is exactly why we emphasized the importance of genuine transformation," Mrs. Richardson told her team. "You can't solve deep-rooted issues with surface-level solutions." She immediately reached out to the airline's leadership, offering to help them implement proper changes. Their initial resistance softened and she shared data showing how airlines using the Richardson protocol had not only improved their public image but also significantly increased their profitability. Back at the terminal, the documentary crew captured an unexpected moment. One of the original flight attendants who had discriminated against Mrs. Richardson was now conducting a training session for new hires. The crew watched as she shared her own story of transformation. "I was the problem," she admitted to the group. "I thought I was just following unwritten rules, but I was perpetuating harm. Meeting Mrs. Richardson, or rather, discriminating against her, became the wake-up call I needed. Now, I have the privilege of helping others wake up too." That afternoon, Mrs. Richardson visited the airline's new training center, where the walls displayed before and after statistics. Employee satisfaction had risen by 60%. Customer complaints about discriminatory treatment had dropped by 85%. But most importantly, the culture had shifted fundamentally. The center's crown jewel was its simulation room, where new hires practiced handling challenging situations. Through roleplay and virtual reality scenarios, they learned to recognize and address their own biases while providing exceptional service to all passengers. "Watch this," the training director said, gesturing to a simulation in progress. A trainee was handling a scenario where a passenger made discriminatory comments about another passenger. The trainee's response was firm but professional, demonstrating how to maintain dignity for all involved while addressing inappropriate behavior. Later that evening, Mrs. Richardson attended a ceremony where the airline was receiving an award for its transformation. The audience included industry leaders, government officials, and civil rights advocates. But what touched her most was seeing the diverse group of airline employees in attendance, all proud to be part of the change. During her acceptance speech, she surprised everyone by inviting the original flight attendants to join her on stage. "These individuals," she said, "represent the possibility of transformation. They showed us that when we're willing to confront our biases and do the hard work of change, anything is possible." The documentary crew captured the moment perfectly, the former antagonists now standing proudly beside her, tears in their eyes, symbolizing how far they'd all come. After the ceremony, Mrs. Richardson received news that would take their initiative to an even broader stage. The United Nations had reached out, wanting to use the Richardson Protocol as a model for cultural transformation in international organizations. "Your approach to changing systemic bias could be applied far beyond the airline industry," the UN representative explained during their call. "We're seeing applications for diplomatic relations, international aid work, and cross-cultural cooperation." As she prepared to leave the airport that night, Mrs. Richardson passed by Gate 23, where her original confrontation had taken place. A young black girl was sitting there with her mother, wearing a pilot's cap and clutching a toy airplane. "Are you Mrs. Richardson?" the mother asked, recognizing her. "My daughter wants to be a pilot. Before your changes, I worried about how she'd be treated in this industry. Now, I believe she can actually achieve her dream." Mrs. Richardson knelt down to the girl's level. "The sky's not the limit anymore," she told her with a warm smile. "It's just the beginning." That night, in her hotel room, Mrs. Richardson reviewed early footage from the documentary. The transformation was clear, not just in policies and procedures, but in the genuine connections being formed between people of all backgrounds. Her phone buzzed with a message from her daughter, "Mom, I just boarded my flight. The crew here is amazing, they're exactly what you hoped they would become. Your legacy isn't just about changing an industry, it's about changing hearts." As she drifted off to sleep, Mrs. Richardson reflected on how a moment that could have been about revenge had instead become about redemption and transformation. The Richardson Protocol wasn't just a set of guidelines, it had become a movement for genuine human connection and understanding. 2 years to the day after the incident that changed the airline industry, Mrs. Richardson boarded a flight from Miami to San Francisco. It was the same route, same airline, but everything else had transformed. She'd chosen this flight deliberately, a personal ritual to mark how far they'd come. The terminal buzzed with a different energy now. Digital displays showcased real-time feedback from passengers about their experiences. A diverse group of flight attendants moved through the space with confidence and purpose. At the gates, customer service representatives handled interactions with a new level of awareness and respect. As she approached the check-in counter, Mrs. Richardson noticed a familiar face, one of the flight attendants who had discriminated against her 2 years ago. But now, the woman wore a different badge, Director of Inclusive Service Training. Mrs. Richardson, the former flight attendant, called out, her eyes bright with genuine warmth. "I was hoping you'd be on this flight. We have something special to show you." The woman led her to a newly installed wall in the terminal dubbed The Journey of Change. It displayed photographs and stories chronicling the transformation of the airline industry over the past 2 years. In the center was a quote from Mrs. Richardson, "True change happens when we choose growth over grievance. Your story, our story, is now part of every new employee's orientation," the director explained. But it's not just about what happened that day. It's about what happened afterward. As they walked to the gate, Mrs. Richardson noticed small but significant changes. The priority boarding announcements were more inclusive. The gate agents made eye contact with every passenger. There was an ease in the interactions between staff and travelers that hadn't existed before. Boarding the plane, Mrs. Richardson was greeted by a crew that reflected the diversity of their passengers. The first-class cabin, once an unwelcoming space for many, now felt genuinely inclusive. A young black executive settled into her seat without receiving the suspicious glances that had once been common. During the flight, the lead flight attendant asked if she could share something with Mrs. Richardson. She brought out a leather-bound book filled with handwritten messages from crew members across the airline industry. "We've been collecting these for months," she explained. "Every person who wrote in this book has a story about how the Richardson Protocol changed their perspective." Mrs. Richardson began reading. The entries were powerful testimonials of personal transformation. "I used to judge people the moment they stepped on my plane. Now I see stories instead of stereotypes. My children notice the difference in me. I'm teaching them to see people, not prejudices. Yesterday, I stood up to a colleague who made a biased comment. 2 years ago, I would have stayed silent." Midway through the flight, the captain made an announcement that brought tears to Mrs. Richardson's eyes. The airline had just received official certification as a global leader in inclusive service, the highest recognition in the industry. They were the first airline to achieve this status. But what truly moved her was the casual conversation she overheard between 2 passengers, a young black woman and an elderly white man. They were discussing business strategies, sharing travel tips, and laughing together. It was the kind of natural interaction that would have been rare 2 years ago. As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, Mrs. Richardson received an email that would cement her legacy. The International Aviation Authority had unanimously voted to make the Richardson Protocol a mandatory requirement for all airlines seeking international certification. The protocol has proven that inclusive service isn't just morally right, it's good business, the announcement read. Airlines implementing these standards have seen an average 45% increase in customer satisfaction and a 30% reduction in service-related complaints. After landing, Mrs. Richardson was surprised by an impromptu gathering at the gate. Airline employees, industry leaders, and even some passengers had assembled to mark the 2-year anniversary of the change that transformed their industry. The CEO of the airline stepped forward to make an announcement. "Today, we're not just celebrating numbers or awards," he said. "We're celebrating a fundamental shift in how we see and treat each other." Mrs. Richardson showed us that the greatest act of leadership isn't wielding power, it's inspiring change. He unveiled a plaque that would be installed in every one of the airline's terminals worldwide. It read, "The Richardson Standard, where dignity takes flight." Below it was an inscription, "In honor of the woman who taught us that the best revenge is transformation." Later that evening, at a small dinner with the original flight crew members involved in the incident, Mrs. Richardson listened as they shared their personal journeys of change. "I remember being so afraid when I realized who you were," one admitted. "I thought you would destroy our careers. Instead, you gave us the chance to become better versions of ourselves." Another flight attendant shared how the protocol had influenced her family. "My daughter is studying aviation now," she said. "She'll enter an industry that's fundamentally different because of you." As the evening wound down, Mrs. Richardson received one final surprise. The airline announced the creation of the Richardson Scholarship, providing full funding for minority students pursuing careers in aviation. "This is how we ensure the change continues," Mrs. Richardson said, addressing the group. "We're not just changing policies, we're changing possibilities." Looking around the room, she saw the living proof of her philosophy. The people who had once treated her with disdain had become champions of inclusion. Their transformation was a testament to the power of choosing education over punishment, growth over retaliation. 2 years ago, she had boarded a plane and faced discrimination. Today, she had witnessed how that moment of injustice had sparked a revolution of compassion. The Richardson Protocol wasn't just a training program anymore. It was a movement that had transformed an industry and touched countless lives. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Richardson looked out the window at a plane taking off into the sunset. She smiled, knowing that somewhere up there, in the skies above, people of all backgrounds were being treated with the dignity they deserved. And that, she realized, was the greatest revenge of all.